When Japan surrendered in 1945, the war was finally over. For the first time in 35 years, the people of Korea could breathe freely. No more forced labor. No more Japanese flags over their schools. No more names stolen by the empire. It should have been a beginning, a sunrise after decades of darkness. But for millions in the North, that sunrise turned into something else entirely. Their freedom was replaced by a different kind of rule. One built not on guns or chains, but on stories. Stories that would turn one man into a god. Welcome to Once Before, the channel where we dive into history through the stories of real people who lived it. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you won't miss the next story. August 15th, 1945. The radio crackled across Asia.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind.
Japan's emperor spoke in a trembling voice, announcing surrender. For Koreans, it was the sound of freedom, something many had only dreamed of their entire lives. In Seoul, people poured into the streets. They tore down Japanese signs, ripped imperial flags, and shouted the word independence until their voices broke. Old men wept, children danced. The nightmare was over. But in the chaos of celebration, few noticed what was happening beyond the horizon. Soviet forces were marching in from the north. American troops were approaching from the south. Both claimed to be liberators. Neither planned to leave soon. When the Allies met to decide Korea's future, they drew a line, the 38th parallel, splitting the peninsula into two zones. The north would be managed by the Soviet Union, the south by the United States. It was meant to be temporary, a way to stabilize the country until independence could be organized. But it wasn't long before temporary turned permanent. The Cold War was beginning. Moscow and Washington had very different visions for the world, and Korea, small, wounded, and divided, became one of its first battlefields. In the South, the Americans backed Syngman Rhee, a hardline anti-communist who had spent years in exile. In the North, the Soviets searched for their own man, someone young, loyal, and easy to control. They found him, a name few Koreans had ever heard: Kim Il-sung. At that moment, he was just another returning guerrilla, a former Red Army officer who had fought small skirmishes against the Japanese in Manchuria. He wasn't famous, he wasn't feared, but he was exactly what the Soviets needed: a Korean face for a communist future. In October 1945, Soviet trucks rolled through Pyongyang's dusty streets carrying loudspeakers and banners. Crowds gathered, unsure what to expect. And then, standing beside Soviet generals, Kim Il-sung stepped up to the microphone. He spoke softly, awkwardly, thanking the Great Soviet Union for liberation. Most people in the crowd didn't even know who he was. But that didn't matter. The rally had been choreographed, the cheering had been rehearsed. It was a performance, and it worked. A leader had been born, not from the people's will, but from someone else's design. And soon, the story of who he was would begin to change. Rewritten, polished, and multiplied until no one could tell fact from fiction. The myth of Kim Il-sung was about to begin. Kim Il-sung's rise wasn't built on power alone. It was built on a story. And that story began the moment the Soviets realized they needed more than a puppet. They needed a symbol. To rule a broken nation, Kim couldn't just be another politician. He had to be the liberator, the father, the son that would guide Korea out of darkness. And so, the mythmakers went to work. Writers, poets, and propagandists gathered in Pyongyang under Soviet supervision. Their job was clear: rewrite history. Take fragments of Kim's real life, his childhood in a poor Christian family, his time in Manchuria, his short service in the Red Army, and forge them into legend. One of the earliest myth-makers was Han Sorya, a novelist who had become one of the most powerful cultural figures in North Korea. Han understood perfectly that stories could shape reality. Under his direction, tales about Kim turned him into something almost supernatural. In one story, he was the boy so wise that even his teachers sought his advice. In another, he rallied exhausted soldiers to victory with nothing but his words. Soon, new stories began to circulate. Kim Il-sung wasn't just a guerrilla anymore. He was a heroic commander who led thousands into battle against the Japanese. He wasn't just a boy from a small village. He was a born leader, organizing resistance movements before he was even a teenager. Every detail was shaped with purpose. Even his name, Il-sung, meaning become the sun, became a symbol. Newspapers wrote that he was the sun that rose over Korea after 35 years of night. The phrase stuck. Ordinary people, exhausted by war, wanted to believe. They needed a hero, and Kim's story gave them one. Within months, radio stations broadcast songs praising his bravery. Posters and portraits appeared everywhere, showing Kim as tall, calm, and radiant. Children learned to call him father. Adults were told that it was he, not the Americans, not the Soviets, who had defeated the Japanese and given them back their country. Of course, that wasn't true. The Japanese surrendered because of the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. But in the new narrative, Kim Il-sung was the liberator, the one who had fought for every Korean's freedom. It wasn't history anymore. It was scripture. The propaganda machine grew with terrifying speed. By 1947, the myth had become a movement. By 1948, when the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was officially founded, Kim Il-sung was no longer a man. He was the great leader. Portraits of Kim appeared in every school, factory, and home. People were expected to bow before his image each morning. His speeches were memorized. His slogans were sung. Every success, a good harvest, a new bridge, even a sunny day, was credited to him. Behind the scenes, teams of propagandists worked day and night, crafting a perfect image. They debated every aspect of his legend. Should Kim be shown as the warrior, the wise teacher, the loving father? The answer? All of them. Almost a god. He would be everything to everyone. Even Kim's childhood was rewritten. In official biographies, he was a boy genius, organizing resistance at 8, inspiring adults with his courage by 12. His father was a saintly revolutionary, his mother a nurturing patriot. Their suffering became symbols of Korea's own pain under Japanese rule. It didn't matter that it was fiction. It mattered that people believed. The myth was no longer just propaganda. It had become religion. And belief was mandatory. Children learned songs like Song of General Kim Il-sung. Factories held study sessions where workers memorized his writings. Public trials punished anyone accused of distorting the truth about the leader. By the early 1950s, North Korea had created something the modern world had never seen before: a totalitarian cult built around one man and sustained entirely by story. In June 1950, the illusion shattered, and the legend deepened. At dawn, North Korean tanks rolled across the 38th parallel. Kim Il-sung had launched a full invasion of the South, declaring he would reunify Korea in 3 days. Behind the scenes, he had begged Stalin for permission, promising a swift victory. He believed his army, trained and armed by the Soviets, would crush the South before America could react. He was wrong. The war spiraled into one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. Cities burned, Families were torn apart. Millions fled their homes. And yet, inside North Korea, the story was told differently. State radio declared it was the South that had invaded first. Kim was not the aggressor. He was the defender, the protector of all Koreans against imperialist invaders. Even as Pyongyang was bombed to ashes, the propaganda machine didn't slow. In underground shelters, soldiers were told that Kim was leading every battle personally, that his courage alone was turning the tide. When the war finally ended in 1953, with the country destroyed and the border right where it began, Kim had lost everything, except his myth. And in a strange way, the devastation only made that myth stronger. People saw him as the man who had stood against the world and survived, a leader who had faced the Americans, the UN, and fate itself, and remained unbroken. To the rest of the world, North Korea was a ruin. Inside its borders, Kim Il-sung had become immortal. After the war, Kim faced a problem. Power shared is power threatened. His government was full of factions: Soviet Koreans, Chinese Koreans, Southern Communists, and local partisans. Each claimed credit for the revolution. Each had their own loyalties. Kim couldn't allow that. Between 1956 and 1960, he began a ruthless campaign to erase every rival. Ministers vanished. Generals were executed. Party members who questioned him disappeared into re-education camps. Accusations of factionalism or anti-party behavior became death sentences. He rewrote history again. Old comrades who had once stood beside him were now branded as traitors. Their faces were airbrushed out of photographs, their names erased from books. The message was clear. There had never been any other revolutionaries, only Kim Il-sung. By the early 1960s, he had achieved something rare even among dictators. He ruled not just through fear, but through faith. Every citizen was expected to believe that their food, their safety, even their breath came from him. And to make sure that faith lasted, Kim began to pass it down like a sacred inheritance. While most communist states promoted ideology, Kim Il-sung promoted family. He told his people that the revolution was not just political, it was bloodline. At first, few noticed what that meant. But slowly, new portraits appeared of his son, Kim Jong-il. Official newspapers began to call him the Dear Leader. State art showed him standing beside his father, guiding the nation together, even though he held no official title. Schools began teaching that loyalty to the leader was loyalty to his family. Propagandists called him the genius of cinema, the brilliant commander, the perfect heir. The myth passed from father to son like a sacred flame, unchallenged, untouchable, and eternal. By the 1970s, Kim Il-sung had done what no other communist leader dared. He turned a revolution into a dynasty. The country began preparing for the unthinkable, a hereditary succession inside a so-called People's Republic. And while outsiders mocked the absurdity, inside North Korea it made perfect sense. The mythology of Kim Il-sung had gone beyond politics. He was not just a ruler anymore, he was the father of the nation, the eternal source of life itself. And a father's legacy must be inherited by his son. By the time Kim Jong-il officially took power in the 1990s, the cult was complete. 3 generations had grown up believing that their leaders were not chosen, they were born. Divine by blood, eternal in spirit. North Korea wasn't just ruled by a man, it was ruled by a myth that refused to die. But why did it work? Why did millions believe stories so obviously impossible? Because for them, belief was survival. North Korea was poor, scarred by war, isolated from the world. People needed something, someone to believe in. By turning Kim into a flawless father, the regime gave them stability, pride, and meaning amid the ruin. Doubt was dangerous. Faith was safe. And over time, faith became truth. By the 1980s, Kim Il-sung's North Korea had become a world sealed in its own story. Foreign journalists called it the Hermit Kingdom, but that didn't capture the depth of it. This was a place where truth itself had been replaced. Citizens woke up to loudspeakers praising the great leader. They worked under his portraits, studied his words, and wept during his speeches. Every wall, every classroom, every newsreel reminded them, Korea exists because of Kim Il-sung. There was no money to spend freely, no freedom to travel, no news from outside. But inside, the people believed they lived in paradise because they'd never seen anything else. When visitors came, they were shown clean streets, perfect farms, smiling workers. None of it was real. Entire towns were staged, food was hidden, citizens rehearsed how to speak. It was theater, an illusion performed for the world, but also for themselves. And behind it all, the regime was watching. Every home had a Kim portrait that had to be dusted daily. Every conversation could be overheard. Every dream belonged to the party. Kim had turned an entire country into one living monument to himself. On July 8, 1994, the great leader died. For the first time in nearly half a century, North Korea faced a day without Kim Il-sung. But mourning wasn't optional. The streets of Pyongyang filled with people collapsing in grief, screaming, beating their chests. Whether it was real or forced didn't matter. In a land built on worship, disbelief itself was dangerous. State television announced that the sun of Juche has set, but promised that its light would never fade. Within hours, the government declared Kim Il-sung the eternal president of North Korea. Even in death, he would remain the country's leader, forever. His body was embalmed and placed in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, where citizens still bow before him today. And so, the circle closed. The man who began as a Soviet puppet had become a god, a farmer's son turned immortal ruler. His myth stronger than his life. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, give the video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to Once Before for more journeys into the darker corners of history. Until next time, remember, the past isn't gone. It's waiting to be told once before.